Welcome to the second in our series of events for property owners in Inverkeithing. Thanks to the miracle of Zoom, we can invite wider audiences and we can also record talks, so welcome all wherever you're watching. We'll shortly be hearing from Inverkeithing local Adrian Neville about the special skills of conservation architect. My name is Emma Griffiths. I'm the Training and Development Officer for the Inverkeithing Heritage Regeneration Project. Apologies if you've heard this before, but in case you haven't, the Inverkeithing Heritage Regeneration Project is a 5-year project running 2019 to 2024, originated by Fife Council. My organisation, Fife Historic Buildings Trust, are delivering the ambitious project on behalf of Fife Council. There are 4 strands to the project: a public realm uplift, a major conservation programme and adaptations to the townhouse to make it fully accessible, a small grants programme, and an activity programme for which I'm responsible. The project has external funding from Historic Environment Scotland and from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, for which we're very grateful and which enables us to reach out through events like this alongside other training and engagement. Before Adrian starts, 2 things. There are podcasts. If you're interested in Inverkeithing, there are a series of 10 podcasts with an introduction episode which cover lots of different aspects of the amazing and fascinating history and archaeology of Inverkeithing. So you can find them on Spotify, you can find them by searching for Inverkeithing Heritage Regeneration. So recommend those if you're interested in finding out more about the background of this fascinating place. And the other thing is there will be a hands-on, the 4th event in this series of events for householders will be a hands-on course for introduction to basic maintenance of your property at the Scottish Lime Centre Trust nearby in Fife. That will be practical, half-day session, and priority will be given for local residents. So that will be taking place on Saturday the 13th of November. Save the date and keep in touch if you would like to be on that course. And now, with apologies for my delay in pressing the record button, I'm handing over to Adrian Neville.
Previous generation. Was doing something funny there and telling me it was being recorded. Everything has been passed to us by previous generations, and we have an enormous amount in Inverkeithing. We're extremely fortunate. It seems to be a cradle of civilization from early days here, and we can benefit from it. Now, is our heritage important? Well, I would say it is. That this slide is showing the Inverkeithing Primary School burning down, which to me was an enormous loss. You might see it as an opportunity for development and new things to come, but I think it's part of our fabric that we're unlikely ever to get back. So to me, it's illustrative that our heritage is important. Primarily, I'll be talking about our built heritage, but it includes an awful lot of different aspects. Things like, you know, the places that we worship in, where we go to transact our business, where we've been governed from, you know, the people that met in the townhouse and the rules and the edicts that came down. And the history is not all ancient, and even to this day it affects us. This is where the food bank operates from at the moment. So there's been centuries of Inverkeithing life based in these buildings. And things too, like our transport, how we got about, how we travelled. This is obviously the train station in Inverkeithing. And apart from the fact that we can get from A and B, the train stations in Scotland and indeed throughout all of Britain are I think, a wonderful bit of our heritage and well worth saving. And it's also about the people who have passed through. And if you look closely in some of the buildings, you'll see little plaques and mentions of people who have been here before. This one's celebrating the birthplace of Samuel Gregg, who's the founder of the Russian Navy. And obviously the monks, and at one stage there was a huge friary here, and that's been a valuable part of our history. And the buildings and houses that people lived in. I live immediately opposite this one. It's Thompson's Lodgings, amazing history of one of the early burgesses here. quite an interesting setting in the most historic part of the building, the town. That's a new extension to the left, to the right of it there. To the left of it is some council houses by Sir Frank Mears, done in probably the 60s. But I actually think they're a very good intervention, and I'll speak a wee bit more about interventions in the historic environment as we go along. And the buildings are interesting as buildings, especially to someone, an architect like me, but they're also interesting for the people who have lived them. And I mentioned Thompson, one of the first Burgess, but there's been a succession of interesting people living in that building. And at the moment, this chap on the right, Murray Grigor, lives in it, and Murray's a well-known filmmaker, and this is him with some unknown pal of his, Sean something or other, I think. And also the story of where we eat and where we drink, and the buildings that came about to provide for that, and where we work. Colwell's paper mill, obviously built in 1914, which was a fairly momentous year for Inverkeithing and indeed the world. So that's it at the start, and this is it at the end. So it starts a whole new chapter. There's the chimneys falling down, and I think we look aptly to see what's going to be the replacement there in Inverkeithing. And it's also the story of how we lived and the wars that we fought, and indeed how we died. This is the graveyard, and I think there are 6 Commonwealth war graves in it. And even the aftermath of the war had an effect. And this is the breakers yard in Inverkeithing, and some of the warships from the Second World War being broken up. And indeed, our heritage is about our land, and this is actually my allotment. It's a lovely place where I like to go and retire at the end of the day. But not only about somewhere to grow our food, but also the land that we dug up to create the buildings that we work in. This is Preston Hill Quarry. Now, I just want to say a wee bit about how I got interested in this. Like many an Irishman, I came to Scotland for my education and studied at Duncan of Jordanson College of Art in Dundee. There's various options that you could take along the way, and one of them was vernacular architecture, which I was fascinated by. And, when I started out looking at it, I thought many of these buildings were very primitive, but I changed my mind the more I looked at them. They're huge, thick walls that are massively insulated. They really thought about how they were done. They were often built in a slope. The roof was lower at one end, so the heat from the animals would rise up and heat the inhabitants. And the importance of the animals be down the bottom too was that the dung went in the other direction. So that one was worth thinking about. And then when I eventually qualified, I went to work in Edinburgh, first in private practice and then for the City Council. And working for the City Council was an amazing experience because they just had a superb collection of buildings to look after. And one of the first jobs I got was the City Arts Centre, extending it, a marvellous Grade A listed building. And one of the issues that the council had at the time was the Scott Monument, and bits of stonework were falling off it onto people. So my boss and I got involved in that one, and early days looking at it and what might be done. And I remember us getting an expert up from English Heritage who had a lot of experience in this sort of monuments and picking his advice. I only stayed there for a few years, so I didn't get to finish that project, but it was just really whetted my appetite and got me excited about the whole conservation area. And that's how I came to look at the scheme for becoming a conservation accredited architect. Most of the bodies in Scotland, surveyors, architects, have some sort of scheme of accreditation. And basically, it's assessing the work that you have done and your knowledge and your interest in the area. So you've got to write a bit about your approach to conservation, demonstrate that you understand the principles involved, and show a body of work to show that you're competent in it. And if they're happy with that, you'll get accreditation. And then you've got to keep on updating it year by year. And it's amazing how much things change. It's even the lime technology and what's recommended, surprisingly different over the last 10 years. Now, one of the questions I want to answer is, do I need a conservation architect? Or why do I need a conservation architect? But I thought actually I needed to go back a step again and say, well, do I actually need an architect? Because there's lots of people who will help you with your building projects who are not necessarily architects. And some of them are very good and some less good. I'm kind of using this photograph to illustrate my answer, in that if you were going to buy a car, it's about more than getting from A to B. And I think it amazes me that people will spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on their property and not employ someone properly trained to look after it. Whereas if they were spending 30,000 in a car, they wouldn't dream of getting one by even to be honest, a second-rate manufacturer. So obviously my encouragement would be to get somebody properly trained. So do I need a conservation architect? Well, what's the difference between a conservation architect and an ordinary architect? If I can give you an illustration, if you were to come to me and say, Adrian, can you build me a skyscraper in New York? I would honestly have to say, whilst I would love to have a go, I don't actually have that in the skill set. And I guess if you came to a New York skyscraper architect and asked them to do a conservation project in Inverkeithing, he equally wouldn't have a clue where to start. So there are architects of all shapes and sizes, but a conservation architect is someone with a particular interest and a particular knowledge about working with our heritage. Now, Donald Rumsfeld, people either love him or hate him, but I thought his explanation of unknowns was a good one to explain why you might go to a conservation architect. It might be, there are things that you will know. You might know, for example, that your building's drafty, your windows are leaky, and you're cold and you need to do something about it. So that's a known. And then there are known unknowns. So you might know that you need some help. So you might ring up a double glazing company and they'll almost certainly say to you, oh yes, no problem at all. We'll come and give you those. These are lovely windows. They're very cheap and very well insulated, and you'll definitely be warm. But the unknown that you probably wouldn't have the background to know is the chances are when they're installed, they will look absolutely atrocious. They will be the wrong proportion. They will look nothing like the traditional windows beside it. The mullions and the fenestration are just not as they're meant to be, because that material is not capable of working to the same sizes and tolerance that a piece of wood is. So that's a brief example as to why you might want to go to a conservation architect. Another reason, and to my mind a less good reason, is that sometimes it's a funding condition. If people are giving you money or a grant towards it, they will want to know that it's been spent properly and not squandered and not doing something that might even harm the building. So maybe later on Fiona can tell us the right rules about this, but roughly speaking, I think the Heritage Trust, if they're going to give you a grant of over £10,000, will insist that you've got a professional of some sort involved. And if it's over £25,000, then they're going to insist that it's a conservation accredited professional. The other reason for going to a conservation accredited architect is that they should have a really good knowledge of best practice. And if they don't know all the answers, well, they'll know where to go and get them and who to ask. And, all that knowledge is going to avoid mistakes for you. It's going to give you a better looking project, and you're going to have something that's more saleable at the end of the day. And they should also have a good knowledge of the statutory requirements, because they've been through the process so many times. They'll be used to writing conservation documents. They'll be used to working with the heritage officer. They'll know what will get through planning and what won't. So that should shorten the whole process for you. And lastly, the chances are with a conservation architect, they're going to be really passionate about it themselves and have tried all these things. And and probably gone to all the courses. Now, one of the things that we're very fortunate here has been so close to the lime centre and lime kilns. It's just a fabulous resource, and the courses are remarkably cheap. And I've been on quite a few of them, and it's really fun to learn how to point in lime. And I've been on the one on how to repair sash and case windows. And it's just, you know, if I'm going to be telling somebody on site how they're doing something, I feel I've got to be able to say that I've actually tried it myself. Now, having got that far, I wanted to go through briefly the process that you would go through if you're getting a grant in Inverkeithing and if you're going to do some repair works yourself. And it's divided up into stages. Now, I think at the moment, most of you would only be at stage 1 of the process. And that starts off with some sort of a conservation report. And there's a number of things that will include, but the first thing would be the historic significance of whatever building's been worked on. Give you an example here, this is Fordall's Lodging. So if you're doing something in that, you'd be talking about when it was built, you'd be talking about the famous people that it was associated with, and I think it was Henderson who owned Fordall Castle, and this was his town lodging. So all that will explain why the building's important and why it's worth preserving, and if there are particular aspects of it that have got historical interest, that particular care should be taken over. Similar vein, Half Crown in Inverkeithing, the historical significance for that building is with Admiral Gregg, a famous citizen. We mentioned him earlier, founder of the Russian Navy. I don't know if you know Gregg the playwright who lives in North Queensferry. He's actually one of his relatives. So it's nice to know that the Greggs are still about town and still being famous men and women. Next thing that we'd look at is the listing. Every listed building has a description of it. You can find it online. It tells you what category it is, and it'll give you a little potted history of it and say why it's been listed. Having done that, then we'd go and look at how it's built, and simple things like, you know, how the skews are constructed, whether it's Scotch slate, how it's rendered, how the gutters are attached to the building. A basic explanation of how it's put together and what the original materials were. And then a photographic survey to record everything that's there. And a set of plans, because we need to come and measure up. And once you have an actual drawing in front of you, it's so much easier to see what the potential of the building is, what can be done, what the historic bits are. You know, you can look at the thickness of walls and things like that. And finally, a condition report, and that's really just going through all the elements and saying what condition they're in. The windows, the window sills, the rainwater goods, the roof, the stonework, the pointing, all these things can be listed on some sort of a document. And this is an example of one that we did for St. Columba's Church in Aberdour. It was actually a quinquennial survey. They get it done every 5 years. And you can see it lists the element, it says what they are, gives a wee description of what sort of condition they're in, and then recommends what sort of repairs need to be carried out. And finally, it says whether it's urgent or something that can be deferred for a few years, and usually puts some sort of price on it. The pricing, it's always a difficult one, because I could go to any of these, say, church buildings and put £500,000 work against them, and all that's going to do is demoralise the people. So I try and be quite sensible about it and come up with a list of things that can be reasonably achieved and a target that's achievable for the congregation. Because, you know, if you've got a congregation of 7 people in their 70s, there's not much point in telling them, here's £500,000 of work to do. Whereas, you know, if you're telling them the gutters need cleaned out and things like that, that is achievable. Then we'd look at the actual proposals and say, look, you've seen the importance of the building, you know what the condition is, this is what we think you should do to make it better and to keep it going for another 10, 20, 100 years or whatever. And then finally a conservation management plan. And that's really, once everything's done, the point is that you're not going to just leave it there. You're going to help the people to look after it in the future. So you're going to say things like, you know, once a year, get a pair of binoculars out and have a wee look at the roof and see if any slates have slipped. Get the gutters cleaned out regularly, because, you know, if your head's dry and your feet's dry, everything's better. And just a list of things that are not too onerous, but if you do them, you'll have no sudden shocks. And by minor interventions every now and then, you'll keep the building in really good condition and avoid a horrendous bill someday as well. So that's stage one, and that's, I suspect, what most of the folk in Inverkeithing are going through at the moment. And that's what you need to do really to get your grant application approved. Stage two is when we get onto the statutory consents, and particularly the planning and the listed building consent. I did ask one local resident here once if he had got planning permission, and he was a fellow countryman. I said, no, I'm claiming Irish exemption. What's Irish exemption? He says, ignorance. But I don't think you can get away with that one. And a lot of these people can actually be very helpful if you get them involved early and explain what you're going to do. Now, that said, I have had some fairly robust conversations with conservation officers, and I'm quite happy to argue for what I think should be done. But, you know, if you work constructively, and I think a robust argument is part of a constructive discussion, you can get a really good outcome a lot of the time. Stage three then is the building warrant. Whereas the planners are concerned about, is the intervention appropriate? What will it look like? How will it fit into the environment? Building control don't care anything about that. They want to know, will it be wind and watertight? Will it be energy efficient? Will it be electrically safe? Are the disabled able to get into it? So that's the third process. It's quite a technical stage. And the final stage, everybody thinks once they get their permissions, that's it all sorted. But actually stage four is probably the most important, because that's when you either get a good job or a bad job, or when you either spend a lot of money or you bring the job in budget. So a good set of tender documents is absolutely vital to bringing your job in budget. So that when the contractor comes, as they want to do, and said, I need another £1,000 to do A, say, but you've included for that in the tender documents. And your architect will be able to advise you too on decent contractors that have done a good job in the past. Because generally speaking, the way it works is, if a contractor does a good job, he will get in the next tender list. And if he does a bad job, he won't. So there's a string of work for somebody who behaves and does a good job, but there's only one job for the guy who messes it up. Now, I thought it might be helpful as well just to show you some projects and to give you some examples of the work that a conservation architect gets involved in, because it's probably more varied than you expect. A lot of the time it's just very simple repairs and maintenance, like my neighbour next door here asking me what he should do about his wall, repointing it, rendering it, or whatever. And very happy to provide that sort of advice, write specifications for the mortar mix, and look after it on site if necessary. This is a project I'm involved in at the moment in Kelty Bridge. A client bought this house and immediately found that it was leaking. It's a listed building and it's in a conservation area. We had a wee word with the conservation officer, and they said, look, definitely make it wind and watertight, but we don't want you recovering it or doing anything else until we get the listed building consent. So that's what we did. We had to take the tiles off and put a membrane on it, and then we applied for a listed building consent, which we have now got. It raised quite a few interesting issues, in that when the roof was stripped, the sarking was of really poor quality, and the timbers on the roof themselves weren't regular at all. They looked like bits of logs that were just taken out of the hedge somewhere or other. So it brings up that old dilemma. Do you replace it like for like with something that has failed, or do you put in something more robust and more modern? There's arguments for both, and they rage on more important buildings than this. And one you might have read about in the press is Hill House, Charles Rennie Mackintosh's building in Helensburgh. Just my favourite building on the planet, probably. But some of Mackintosh's details were not the best. So when you're going to restore that, are you faithful to Mackintosh, or do you do something that's going to keep the building going for another 100 years? I don't honestly know the answer. I think you've got to take it on a building for building basis, but I'd be intrigued to hear the thoughts of those who are listening. This is a building in Post Office Lane in North Queensferry. It was originally rendered in cement, and that was cracked, and the building was quite damp. The owner's a gentleman in his 90s, a relative of mine, and he wasn't keen to do anything that would need re-lime washed every 4 years. So we're trying to find something that would look after the building but wouldn't need a huge amount of maintenance. So with the help of Roz and the Lime Centre, again, we came up with this product called Thermochromex, and it's a the hose down at the moment, but it doesn't need repeated lime washing. So where maintenance is going to be an issue, it's quite a good solution. Very interesting, when we were taking the building apart, it became evident that it was built in 2 parts. So the bottom half is sort of rough boulders with a clay filling in the middle, and not too robust, and I think some of the render was maybe holding it together in places, whereas the top half is regular ashlar. So fascinating to see what was once there was a single-storey building. I'll come back to this one later. You might notice as well over the door there's a marriage lintel, which was very traditional, and I'll mention that again as the talk goes on. Quite a bit of our work is alterations and reusing and repurposing historic and listed buildings. This bit of conversion isn't one that I did, but it's in a building that I'm extending at the moment. And I wanted to show this to illustrate the difference between preservation and conservation. Preservation is about keeping something exactly as it was. And you know, if you were building a museum, you would be preserving it and keeping it exactly as it was when William Shakespeare or whoever lived here. Whereas conservation is about keeping the thing going so it will be valued and appreciated and won't fall into disrepair because people will love it and find it useful. So this is a house, and nobody would be willing to go to an outside toilet these days, I don't think. So in order to keep this building functioning and loved as a house, obviously creating an indoor toilet somewhere was an essential. So I think that's an example of an appropriate intervention that gives the building new life. This is Park House in Couris. We were doing some alterations to one of the flats. The original requirement, the owner wanted it knocked about quite a bit to create the sort of interior that they were looking for, and knock between a kitchen and a dining room. And we had a wee look at that. We drew up a plan, and we came back and said, look, I think we can achieve what you're looking for by reallocating the rooms without knocking anything together. So what we ended up was a solution that not only conserved the historic fabric of the building, but was actually much cheaper for the owner. And that seems to be a win-win if you can get better conservation and a lower cost for the client. And to give you another example of the odd things that a conservation architect gets involved in, this was a project to put in a gate at the end of the driveway. This is Long Sutton Manor. The owner is an architect, though I don't think she bought this with the funds from her architecture practice. I think it was, they own online shops and things as well. She had previously applied for planning permission for a gate, and it was turned down because it was seen to be too suburban in a rural location. It was appealed, and the appeal was refused. So she came to me, and we've had a wee word with the planners. We're putting in a fairly simple agricultural style 5-bar hockey stick gate that you can see through, and that seems to be acceptable as something for a rural location. Extensions, do quite a few extensions to listed buildings. This is, because it's in England, it's not ABC, it's a grade 2 listed building. It's an oak frame again, tiling. Oops, all right, I'll go back a bit. On the roof, the owner wanted to extend immediately out the back beside an existing extension. And we looked at it and said, well, yes, we could, but we're really reluctant to do that because we're interfering with the historic fabric of the building. But we could achieve exactly the same kitchen extension by just extending on the end of the existing extension. So we were doing a modern intervention, but we were doing it to another intervention, and the original fabric of the building wasn't touched at all. And she seems to be very happy with that as a solution. Infills. In recent years, we've done quite a few infills where folk are looking for houses in a conservation village or town. This is one that I did for myself. It's actually the building that I'm sitting in at the moment. There was a gap site in the corner, and we were looking, well, I was looking for an office really to build. Originally thinking I would build something in render, just do block work and render. But how do we look at stone? And there was actually very little extra cost involved in using natural stone. It used to be when you built stone, you'd have to build a block work back and build against it. But now companies like Marshall's cut the stone like block work, and it's relatively simple to build. One of the issues tends to be that, you know, 100mm block looks very thin and doesn't look right on the corner of a building. And the way of getting over that here was to use an L-shaped block at the corner. So we've got a 200mm end really as you turn, and it looks much more appropriate. This is the building now, almost 15 years after it was built, has blended into the scenery of the street. I was stopped recently by some old chap who lived in the village 50 years ago or something, and he was telling me that he used to walk past this building when he was a young lad. I smiled and chatted on, but didn't mention to him, you know, unless he was a young lad 15 years ago, he most definitely didn't. This is Aberdour again, listed church building, and we were building a rectory. The decision we made there was not to try and match the church building. We thought it was inappropriate, but looked at the other houses around in the village and matched those. I want to say something about new builds too, because in villages like Aberdour, we quite often get asked to do new buildings. And although they're not always in a conservation area, it takes a bit of thought sometimes as to what's appropriate for that location. And as you might have guessed, I got very excited about some of the oak frame buildings I've been working at. And you see buildings that are built 30 years ago and they're ready for knocking down. Yet you see old buildings like that one I showed you in Long Sutton 400 or 500 years ago, and they're going to last another 400 or 500 years. And to my mind, I think, gosh, that's technology that works, and it really is sustainable. So I've got a wonderful client for this project in Inverkeithing Park. he's also my doctor, so I have explained to him if he wants a guarantee in the building, he's got to keep me alive. So, this is one of the carpenters who's actually building it. When it was being built, it was built in well, a lot of the trees came from France, but the sewing up of them and the preparation for it was done in a shed in Bristol. This is the carpenter who was actually working on the project, and this was him selecting some of the cross members. This chap here is Rupert Newman, who owns the company. He wrote a book called Oak Frame Structures, and it's absolutely marvellously helpful book, and if anybody's interested in the subject, well worth getting a hold of. When I was starting looking into this, I rang up lots of companies, and the general approach was, well, if you employ us and we get an order, we'll show you how we do this. Whereas I rang up Rupert, and without any order, he was absolutely happy to tell me anything I wanted to know, sent me all sorts of details, and he's just about the most knowledgeable person on the subject I've ever met. He also teaches structural carpentry in Edinburgh University, because they see that as an academic subject over there, and you can get a degree in carpentry, which I think is a marvellous thing. And Rupert gets involved in it, and he's been up here several times building buildings with us in Scotland. And this is it, being built on site in Aberdare. And if anybody wants to go and see it now, it's number 11 Ducat Park. And I'm convinced in 500 years' time it will still be here, but it's one that nobody will prove me wrong on, I don't think. This is another one. This is in South Queensferry, beside the Carmelite Monastery, building built in 14 something or other. It's not directly attached to the building. We did it as a separate one. We were trying to get something, well, basically, the only thing left of the monastery is the original church, and all the outbuildings have gone. The church is absolutely beautiful inside, but they've nowhere, loads of people want weddings, but they've got nowhere to hold functions associated with those weddings. So we were approached to come up with an idea of something appropriate for this setting in beside an A-listed building. And what we came up with essentially was something using very traditional materials and construction techniques, but in a modern form. So this is actually an oak frame building, but it's a flat roof building with a glass pyramid in the center of it. So to my mind, it's a living tradition, and we're building on that, and we're doing new things with it. You can decide whether you think it's appropriate or not. And we even got to sign it. This is the end of the building where the kitchen has been built beside it, and will get covered up. But you can see I got to sign it as the architect. The minister there is the Reverend Dr. Ian McRobert, and Rupert Newman's that chap you saw in the photographs a while ago. Learn lots of new things when you're doing these. I actually took a day off work and asked if I could become the apprentice and go and hammer in pegs for the day. And I've got to say, it's the most fun day at work I've ever had. The couple who were project managing this for the church, the lady was German, and her father was a carpenter. So she was quite used to all this sort of stuff. And she brought along some of the German traditions. And one of them was a sort of topping out ceremony where a young tree sap was brought along and tied to it with bunting and all the rest of it. I'm sure the church, if they'd known in advance, probably wouldn't have approved of this, but Rupert Newman was telling us the history behind this was actually that they were worried that the tree spirits would be disturbed when the trees to make the oak frame were cut down. So this was inviting them back again with a new fresh tree on top. Do a lot of conservation work in Edinburgh, and this is actually an attic conversion in a conservation area. And done a lot of work over the years for the University of Aberdeen in Dundee. They've got a lovely old building called Old College, with the original college there, over 100 years old, and was getting to the stage where a lot of the things were beginning to fail. This is pre any work that we'd done. A lot of the slates were slipping, the lead work was cracked, it was leaking during the snow. You can see at the far end there's a copper roof there, and that was now failing in multiple places. And the staff were getting very annoyed when from time to time their lectures got flooded and the likes. We spent quite a lot of time talking to the conservation officer in Dundee. Despite the fact that Emma said this, it definitely isn't a mafia, he was another Irishman and was very helpful. He was keen to see the thing preserved and not messed. He was willing to let us away with some things, like as long as we put slate in the visible bits of the roof, he would have let us use single ply, green coloured membrane, plastic essentially, on the flat top of the roof. The client in Abertay, a chap called Ian Simpson, was a very enlightened chap and took a long, hard think about it and looked really at the life cycle costs as much as the immediate cost, and allowed us to do a really good job, to be honest. You can see here, this is the lead work redone. This is some of the new slating that we have just put in. And best of all, we were allowed to put a beautiful new copper roof in the top. And really, this is one of my favourite jobs I've ever been involved in, because it was learning a whole new skill. I didn't have a lot of experience prior to this of doing copper roofs, and the copper workers were just a joy to work with. And the thing is, the copper roof that was on lasted the best bit of 100 years. And this one, I'm absolutely convinced, will last another 100 years. And if you think of the cost of a roof that you don't have to maintain in that time, I think it's real value for money. And the university will save money in the longer run. Long-term thinking is unusual, but it's fabulous when you see it. And I think it's one of the jobs of the conservation architect to talk to clients and explain the benefits, and seeing that actually, in some ways, doing the right thing saves you money. As well as the roof being in bad condition, the stonework was also in poor condition. So we had to look at that and looked at how we repaired it. One of the first things we did was to go and look at the mortar. We took out a sample and we took it down to the lime centre, and they had a look and helped us to match. They also have lots of really good information on techniques for repointing. Quite awkward in some of these things with very thin joints. So again, you use them because they're a fabulous resource. I can't believe how economical it is, and I would go back to them time and time again.
Adrian, just if I can stop you just for a moment, someone has asked in the chat, what was the slate type on the Abertay building? Just while you're at those slides.
A good question. Again, there was a compromise in that we did end up with a Spanish slate, and we talked about doing it in diminishing courses, but that was just one too far for the client. The best choice, the best match would have been a slate from Wales, which we could have got in diminishing courses, but that's where the line was drawn. Now we did reuse as much of the slate as we could. My guess was that we'd have lost about 1/3 of it. In actual fact, we lost about half. But we managed to reuse the stuff in the most prominent places.
Mm-hmm. So you lost on the slate, but you won on the copper.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was only telling the good bit of the story.
Of course. Okay, I'll let you carry on. I'll mute again.
Okay. The final bit of the story was really the stonework. Some of it we could make good. Other bits it was completely shot. and we had to look for a matching stone. We had a report from the British Geological Survey. They've got records of stone all throughout the country. It's quite important to match not just the colour, but the character of the stone, because if you get it wrong, it can actually exacerbate decay. So we found 2 quarries, one in Scotland and one in England, that were suitable. We got samples from them both, and the English one seemed like a better match. We had lots of debates, and even among experts that we talked to, there was great debate over things like cells, whether the bedding should be at a different angle or not. Could go on for days about that one, but a fascinating study. And again, you know, despite the slate, and I think they did their best, honestly, on the slate, there's a client willing to probably spend every penny that they had available to do a reasonable job. So that's a wee bit of a story of what we do. I would just encourage folk to ring up an architect, and probably particularly a conservation architect, if they're looking at a project. Even if you're not going to employ them, to be honest, you'll probably get a lot of good advice for nothing. And very often the answer will be, oh, drop in for a cup of coffee and we'll have a chat about it. Most architects are passionate about this sort of stuff, so they will talk to you at length. That's the only downside, perhaps. But it's good free information. And I would say, when you're working with old buildings, expect the unexpected. And, you know, I've come across skeletons several times. It's not unusual when you're working with old buildings. I haven't, but I know a lot of my colleagues have come across unexploded bombs. Nothing to do with my accent. These are World War II. But at the end of the day, your conservation architect is there to help you and to hold your hand throughout the job and to make it as an enjoyable experience as possible. So thank you very much indeed for listening.
Adrian, that was fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there may be some other questions, but you did refer to one of the reasons that people might engage a conservation architect would be grant conditions. Now, I'd just like to reiterate, we don't impose the grant conditions, or we don't dream them up. But we are, as in terms of delivering the scheme on behalf of Fife Council, we have to impose the conditions that the funders themselves have. So for grants of up to 10,000, I think over £10,000, Historic Environment Scotland require you to engage a professional, and that's just to make sure that you have tenders coming back that are singing from the same song sheet, so that you can easily compare the quotes that you get. If the grant you're being awarded is 25,000 or over, they really want you to be in the safe hands of a conservation accredited professional. So that might be an architect or a surveyor, but that's the reason that there are those grant conditions. I'm going to stop recording now.